Kiki's Book Nook!
The Old Testament. A Wonderful World. In the beginning, there was nothing at all. No sunshine, no land, no animals, no people. Can you even imagine that? Absolutely nothing. Then God created heaven and earth and light so that there could be day and night. And he separated the water from dry land and covered the land with beautiful plants and trees and lovely green grass. He made the sun to shine during the day and the moon and stars to light up the night sky. God filled the seas with enormous whales and bright shiny fish, leaping dolphins and wobbly jellyfish. Then he filled the skies with beautiful birds of every color imaginable. Next he made animals of all shapes and sizes. Spotted cheetahs that could run like the wind, slow tortoises that carried their homes on their backs, huge elephants with long trunks, and many, many more. Last of all, God made man and woman and told them to take care of this wonderful world and all the living creatures on it. God was pleased with all he had made and done, so on the seventh day he rested and made that day a special day, a day to stop working and to give thanks. Disobeying God. God had made Adam, the very first man, in his own image. He created a beautiful garden for him filled with colorful plants and wonderful trees and told him to help himself to any fruit except for the fruit from the tree of knowledge. But there were plenty of other delicious things to eat. God brought all the animals to Adam for him to name. But none of the animals were like him, and Adam was lonely, so God created a woman, Eve, to be his special friend and companion. They had no clothes to wear, but that didn't bother them at all. Now of all the animals, the most cunning was the snake. One day he said to Eve, "Why don't you eat from the tree of knowledge? The fruit is delicious and it won't harm you." And the fruit looked so good that Eve picked some and offered it to Adam too, and they both ate it. At once they realized they were naked and tried to cover themselves with leaves. God was very angry. He cursed the snake and sent Adam and Eve away. From now on, they would have to work hard to make their own food and clothes. Then he placed an angel with a flaming sword to guard the entrance to the garden. Noah builds an ark. Years passed, and soon there were lots of people in the world. But they were becoming more and more wicked, and this made God sad. He made up his mind to send a terrible flood to destroy everything. But there was one good man on earth who loved and obeyed God. His name was Noah. God told Noah to build an enormous boat, an ark, so that he and his family might be saved along with 2 of every living creature. People thought Noah was silly building a boat in the middle of the land, and they made fun of him. But he ignored them, for he trusted God. It took Noah and his 3 sons a long, long time to build the ark, but when it was finished, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives loaded it with food for themselves and the animals. Then God sent the animals to the ark 2 by 2, 1 male and 1 female of every kind of animal that lived upon the earth or flew in the skies. Once they were all safely in, God closed the door behind them. The flood. Now it began to rain, and how it rained! Water poured down from the skies and covered all the land. Every living creature was drowned. All the towns and cities were washed away. But the ark and its precious cargo floated free on a world of water. For 40 days and 40 nights it rained. Then, at last, it stopped. After a while, the flood waters began to go down. Noah sent out a dove, and when it returned with an olive leaf in its beak, Noah knew that the flood was over, for the trees were growing again. It was time for Noah and the animals to leave the ark. Noah was filled with gratitude, and God promised to never again send such a dreadful flood. He put a beautiful rainbow in the sky to remind everyone of this promise. The Tower of Babel. To begin with, the world had only one language, so everyone could understand everyone else. There came a time when some of Noah's descendants decided to build a city which would be famous throughout the land, with a tower reaching to the heavens. But God feared they were becoming too proud and vain, so he made them unable to understand one another. Soon a great babel of voices was heard, with everyone speaking a different language. No one could understand anyone else. In all the confusion, building stopped and the people scattered far and wide. The tower became known as the Tower of Babel. the wonderful coat. Jacob lived in Canaan. He had 12 sons, but Joseph was his favorite. To show just how much he loved him, Jacob had a wonderful coat made for him, covered with colorful embroidery. Joseph's brothers were jealous, but what really angered them was when he began telling them of the dreams he had. "Last night I dreamt we were collecting sheaves of grain, when suddenly my sheaf stood up straight and yours all bowed down before it," Joseph told his brothers. "What are you saying?" they growled. "That you're going to rule over us some day? Go away." Joseph dreamt that the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down before him. Even his father was cross when he heard about the latest dream. "You think your mother and I and your brothers are going to bow down to you? Don't get too big for your boots." But Jacob did secretly wonder what Joseph's dream might mean. Sold into slavery. Joseph's brothers had had enough. The time had come to get rid of their annoying brother, so one day when they were out in the fields, the brothers tore off his precious multicolored coat and threw him in a deep pit. They would have left him there, but soon they saw a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passing by on their camels on their way to Egypt, and quick as a flash they decided to sell him to the traders. They told his poor father that he had been killed by a wild animal. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to one of Pharaoh's officials, a man named Potiphar. Joseph was clever and hard-working, and soon Potiphar placed him in charge of his whole household. But Potiphar's wife told lies about Joseph to her husband, and so it was that poor Joseph found himself thrown into jail. There, Joseph came across Pharaoh's wine steward and his chief baker, who had angered Pharaoh. They both had strange dreams, and with the help of God, Joseph was able to explain what the dreams meant. The baker had a dream about birds eating bread from his basket, and Joseph sadly told him that Pharaoh would order his execution, but the wine steward's dream about squeezing grapes into Pharaoh's wine cup meant that he would be pardoned. Joseph asked him to remember how he had helped him when he was released from jail, but he didn't. Pharaoh's strange dream. One night, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had a strange dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came 7 fat, healthy-looking cows, followed by 7 more cows, but these ones were ugly and thin. They ate of the fat cows and looked just as sickly as before. Pharaoh had another dream. In this dream, the 7 thin heads of grain swallowed up 7 healthy, full heads. In the morning, Pharaoh sent for all the wise men of Egypt, but no one could tell him what his strange dreams might mean until the wine steward remembered Joseph and the slave was brought before Pharaoh. God helped Joseph to explain the dreams. He told Pharaoh the 2 dreams are one and the same. The 7 cows and the 7 heads of grain are 7 years. The land will be blessed with 7 years of healthy crops and fine harvests, but they will be followed by 7 years of dreadful famine. You will need to plan very carefully to prepare. Then Pharaoh replied, "Clearly, you are the man for the job. I will put you in charge of my land, and you will be second only to me in all of Egypt." So Joseph traveled throughout the land, riding in a fine chariot to make sure food was put aside for the hard times ahead. Just as he had foretold, for 7 years the crops grew better than ever before, and so much grain was put away in storehouses that he gave up counting it. After 7 years, the famine began. When people began to run out of food, Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold the corn. No one in Egypt went hungry. The baby in the reeds. What could Moses' mother do? Her baby boy was healthy and beautiful, but the ruler of Egypt had ordered all Hebrew baby boys killed. So she wrapped him in a shawl and placed him in a basket, then lowered it into the water among the reeds. By chance, the king's daughter came down to the river and found the basket. "This must be one of the Hebrew babies," she said softly, and she picked him up and cradled him gently. Moses' sister was watching from behind some bushes. She bravely stepped forward and offered to fetch someone to nurse the baby. The princess agreed, and Miriam darted off to find her mother, who looked after Moses until he was old enough for the princess to take to the palace. Plagues. God sent Moses and his brother Aaron to ask the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, to let the Hebrews go free. But Pharaoh refused, so God sent a series of plagues upon the Egyptians, each more terrible than the last. He changed the waters of the Nile into blood so that all the fish died and the air stank. Then he sent a plague of frogs hopping into every nook and cranny. Gnats, flies, animal sickness, and boils all followed, one after the other, but still Pharaoh wouldn't change his mind. Next came thunder and heavy hail, which stripped the land, while lightning struck again and again and fires blazed. Then came a swarm of locusts. Nothing green remained in all of Egypt. After this, God sent total darkness for 3 whole days. But then the time had come for the most dreadful plague of all, the Passover. Moses warned Pharaoh that God would pass through the country at midnight, and every firstborn son in the land would die, from the son of Pharaoh himself to the son of the lowliest slave girl, and even the firstborn of the animals as well. Pharaoh would not listen. Moses told his people that each family must kill a lamb and smear the blood on the doorframe and eat the meat in a special way. The next day the land was filled with the sound of mourning, for all the firstborn sons had died, even Pharaoh's son. But God had passed over the houses of the Israelites, and they were spared. Now the Egyptians couldn't get rid of the Hebrews quick enough, and so Moses and his people prepared to leave Egypt. Crossing the Red Sea. The Hebrews were terrified. They had traveled across the desert, but now their way was barred by the Red Sea, and Pharaoh had changed his mind and had sent an army after them. "Why did you bring us all this way, just to have us killed or dragged back into slavery?" they cried to Moses. But Moses did not give up his faith in God. "God will look after us," he said confidently, "and he will crush our enemy." Then God told Moses to raise his staff and stretch out his hand over the sea to divide the water. Moses stood before the sea and raised his hand, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians were hard on the heels of the Hebrews, and swiftly followed them into the sea along the path that God had made. But God struck them with confusion so that the wheels of the chariots came off, and everywhere there was chaos. Then he closed the waters together, and the Egyptians were all swept under the sea. Of all that mighty army there were no survivors, not one single horse, not one single soldier. The people of Israel, safe on the far shore of the Red Sea, were filled with gratitude and relief, and sang and danced in their joy, for they knew that their God was both mighty and merciful, and they praised him greatly. Moses sees the Promised Land. Moses and the Hebrew people spent many long, hard years in the desert. They were hungry and thirsty, but God sent them food and water. He told Moses to go to Mount Sinai. There on the top of the mountain, God spoke to him and gave him special instructions to pass on to his people, telling them how they should worship him and how they should live their lives. These were the 10 Commandments. The people promised to obey, but they didn't always remember. When Moses was old, he asked God to choose someone to lead the people after his death, and God chose Joshua, a good man. Finally, it was time for Moses to leave his people. He climbed a mountain, and God showed him the land of Canaan in the distance, the land that had been promised to his ancestors, a land of rich soil and flowing water, full of good things to eat and drink. Moses died on the mountain. He was 120 years old. The people were sad. They knew there would never be another prophet like him, who had spoken with God face to face. The walls of Jericho. It was time for the Israelites to take the Promised Land. The people of Jericho laughed at them from behind their strong, high walls. "You'll never get in," they jeered, but Joshua was unafraid. He knew God would help them. God told Joshua exactly what to do. Once a day for 6 days, the Israelite army marched quietly around the city while priests blew on trumpets. On the 7th day, when the trumpets sounded, the Israelites raised a mighty cry, and the city walls trembled and then collapsed before them. The soldiers charged in and took the city, and the story of how the Lord had helped Joshua take Jericho spread far and wide. Faithful Ruth. Naomi was moving back to Bethlehem. Her husband and sons had died, and she wanted to go home, but she begged her beloved daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to stay behind, for she was penniless and she knew that her life would be hard. Orpah and Ruth loved Naomi dearly. and did not want to stay behind, but finally Orpah agreed to go home. Loyal Ruth, however, said earnestly, "Don't ask me to leave. I will go wherever you go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So it was Ruth and Naomi who came to Bethlehem. Soon they had no food left, and brave Ruth went out into the fields where workers were harvesting the crops and asked the owner if she could pick up any of the barley that his workers left behind. Boaz had heard about how loyal Ruth had been to Naomi. He let her work in his fields and told his servants to share their food with her. He even told them to drop some of the barley for her to pick up. When Ruth returned with a full basket of food and said how kind Boaz had been, Naomi knew that the Lord was looking after them, for Boaz was a relation of hers. In time, Ruth married Boaz, and when they had a son, there was no happier woman in the whole of Bethlehem than Naomi. Samson the Strong. Samson was stronger and braver than any other man. When he was born, God told his parents that he would deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. To show how special he was, Samson's parents never once cut his hair. The Philistines feared Samson, for he carried out many attacks against them. But when he fell in love with the beautiful Philistine Delilah, she tried to find out the secret of his strength. Night after night, treacherous Delilah pleaded with Samson to tell her his secret. In the end, he said, "If anyone were to cut my hair off, then I would lose all my strength." That night, the Philistines crept into his room and cut off his hair. He was powerless as they bound and blinded him and threw him into prison. Over time, Samson's hair grew back. One day, the Philistine rulers were gathered for a feast in a crowded temple. Samson was brought out to be made fun of. He was chained between the two central pillars of the temple. There he prayed to God with all his heart. "Give me strength just one more time, Lord, so I can take revenge upon my enemies." Once more, Samson was filled with strength. He pushed against the pillars with all his might, and they toppled and the temple crashed down, killing everyone inside. A stone in a sling. David was just a shepherd boy. He was the youngest of his family, and he had many brothers who were older and stronger than he was. But God had chosen him as the future leader of Israel. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines, and the two armies had gathered to do battle. Young David had brought food to his brothers who were fighting in the army. The Philistines had a mighty champion. His name was Goliath, and he was powerful and strong, and 10 feet tall. Goliath challenged the Israelites to single combat, but no one dared to fight him. No one, that is, apart from David. David stood before Goliath. God had been with him when he had protected his sheep from lions and bears, and David knew that God would be with him now. He stood there with nothing but his staff, a sling, and 5 stones. Goliath laughed at him, but David fearlessly ran forward, putting a stone in his sling and flinging it with all his might. It hit Goliath on his forehead, and when he fell to the ground, David raced up and cut off his head using Goliath's own sword. The Philistines were so shocked that they turned and ran away. The battle had been won by a shepherd boy and God. A wise ruler. Solomon was David's son. When David died an old man, Solomon was crowned king. Soon after, God spoke to him in a dream and told him he would give him whatever he asked for. Solomon thought carefully then. Instead of asking for wealth or long life or great victories, he asked for wisdom to rule wisely over God's people, for he wanted to be a good king like his father. God was pleased. "I will give you wisdom," he said, "but I will also give you those things you didn't ask for." When Solomon awoke, he felt comforted and strengthened, knowing that God was with him. 2 women came before Solomon holding a baby between them. They had both had babies at the same time, and one of the babies had died. Now they both said that this baby was theirs. The king called for his sword, and then told a guard, "Cut the child in 2 and give half to one woman and half to the other." One woman cried out in horror, "No, no, my lord. Give her the baby. Don't kill him. I would rather she looked after him than he died." But the other nodded, for she thought this was fair. Then Solomon said, "Give the baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his true mother." Then people realized how wise and clever God had made him. Jonah and the Big fish. Jonah was a prophet. One day God told him to go to Nineveh, many miles away, and tell the people there that unless they turned from their wicked ways, God would destroy their fine city. Now, Jonah did not want to go and warn the people of Nineveh. He thought they deserved to be punished. So instead of doing as God told him, Jonah boarded a ship heading in the opposite direction to Nineveh. A dreadful storm blew in from nowhere. The winds howled and the waves towered above the ship. Jonah knew that it was all because of him. He had made God angry. So he told the terrified sailors to cast him overboard, and reluctantly they lowered him over the side. Instantly the sea became calm. The amazed sailors began to pray to God with all their hearts, realizing now that he was the one true God. But what about Jonah? He sank swiftly to the bottom of the sea, certain he was going to die. But before he could take his last breath, God sent an enormous fish to swallow Jonah whole, and there inside the fish Jonah could breathe once again and was safe. For 3 days and nights Jonah sat inside the belly of the fish. He had plenty of time to feel sorry for having disobeyed God. He prayed to God, thanking him for saving him and letting him know how sorry he was. Then God commanded the fish to spit Jonah up safe and sound onto dry land. And when God once again asked him to take his message to Nineveh, Jonah was ready to do as he was told. In the lion's den. Daniel had an important job in the court of King Darius of Persia. He was in exile from Jerusalem, but the king trusted him. The other officials were jealous. They knew Daniel prayed every day, and they came up with a nasty plan. They had the king sign an order stating that for 30 days, anyone asking anything of any god or man except the king should be thrown into a den of lions. Daniel prayed just as he had always done. He would not stop or even hide what he was doing. His enemies rushed to the king and told him. Darius's heart sank, but he could not change the law. "You have been loyal to your God. I hope he can save you," he said sadly, as Daniel was thrown to the lions. That evening, the king did not sleep a wink. At first light, he rushed down to the pit. "Daniel," he cried out, more in desperation than hope, "has your God been able to save you?" How thrilled and amazed he was when he saw Daniel sitting amongst the lions, completely unharmed, for God had sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. "Your God truly is wonderful," said King Darius, and he ordered that from then on, everyone in the kingdom should respect and honor Daniel's God. As for the wicked men who had tricked him, they were thrown into the pit themselves, and this time the lions were ruthless. The Brave Queen. King Xerxes of Persia was looking for a new queen. From all the beautiful young girls of the land, he chose lovely Esther. Esther did not tell him she was a Jew. The king's advisor, Haman, hated Jews, especially Esther's cousin Mordecai. Haman tricked the king into signing a decree that ordered the killing of all Jews. Esther's cousin told her that she had to try to get the king to change his mind. Esther was frightened. To go before the king without a summons was punishable by death. Only if the king held out his scepter would the person be spared. But Mordecai sent another message saying, "Maybe God made you queen precisely so that you can save his people." Esther was scared, but made up her mind to go to the king. When he saw her, he smiled and held out his golden scepter, asking her what she wanted. Esther could not bring herself to ask the king there and then. Instead, she invited him and Haman to a banquet in her room. When the king came to dinner, he offered her anything she wanted, up to half his kingdom. Esther bravely told him that she was a Jew, and she asked him to save her people. When the king found out how Haman had tricked him, he sent him to the gallows. He couldn't change the decree, but he made another one saying that the Jews would be allowed to defend themselves. When the Jews were attacked, they were able to fight back, and they overcame their enemies. They were saved, and every year the Jewish people celebrate the bravery of beautiful Queen Esther.